The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the National Hispanic and Latinos ATTC webinar, The Role of Culture in the Treatment of Latinos with Substance Use Disorders. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Jorge Partida, founder and director of Sustainable Wellness and Health, and I will tell you about him a little later. During today's webinar, all participants will be muted. The audio will be streamed through the computer, so please make sure your computer speakers are turned on and up to hear today's presentation. First, I'm going to review a few housekeeping items with everyone. If you notice that your viewer does not fit your screen, you can expand it by clicking the Expand button located in the top right corner indicated by the red arrow over here. Now you'll see that your viewer is expanded to fit the entire screen. Also, you can collapse the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen by clicking on the small red arrow on the left of the toolbar. And then click the arrow again to expand the toolbar, and it will expand. As I mentioned, all participants will be muted, so as we move through the presentation, if you have a question for our presenter, you can use the chat box on the toolbar. Simply type your question and hit send. And as I spoke with Dr. Partida, we decided that we can pause for questions during the middle of the presentation, or we can wait till the end of the presentation and then we'll answer your questions. A recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides will be available at our website at www.attcnetwork.org Hispanic Latino approximately 1 week from today. You can also find recording and PowerPoint slides from all of our past webinars at the same URL. One NADAC, NBCC, and ICRC Continuing Education Credit is available for those who attend today's live event. So if you're interested in obtaining CUs from these organizations, please email us at hispanic@attcaribe.uccaribe.edu. Today's webinar is sponsored by the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC. As of October 1st of 2012, the network has been restructured and now consists of 10 regional ATTCs, 4 national focus area ATTCs, along with the network coordinating office. As you can see by this map, the ATTC network regions were realigned to better fit the current HHS regions. And the 4 national focus area ATTCs are listed on the left. Today's webinar is the 10th in a series that the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC is offering. The ATTC network is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and serves a critical role in improving the health of our nation. The network achieves this by translating, disseminating, and promoting the adoption and implementation of evidence-based clinical practices and strives to improve the health and wellness of individuals whose lives have been impacted by substance use disorders. You can learn more about the network's products and programs by visiting the attcnetwork.org. As I mentioned, the ATTC network is funded by SAMHSA. SAMHSA strives to reduce the impact of substance abuse and mental illness on America's communities through its programs and services, and demonstrates that behavioral health is essential to health, that prevention works, treatment is effective, and people can recover from mental health and substance use disorders. Okay. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker today. His name is Jorge Partida. Dr. Partida is a psychologist, green advocate, and indigenous healer. He was born in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico, and immigrated to Chicago at 9 years of age. Dr. Partida has been a consultant on many national and international projects in the areas of education, health, diversity, and spirituality. He has worked with local and national governments to coordinate services for those most impacted by poverty, war, and displacement. He has worked in Liberia, Africa, in the creation of boy soldiers, and has worked to form intentional communities in poverty-impacted countries of Latin America. Dr. Partida is the author of The Promise of the Fifth Son and A Week of Awakening. His writing integrates psychology with native healing traditions to form an easy-to-use self-help approach. Dr. Partida has designed and facilitated healing workshops that incorporate ritual and practice. He has served as director of the PsyD program at John F. Kennedy University and as deputy director of behavioral health with the San Francisco Department of Public Health. He was the executive director of the United States Green Building Council in Los Angeles and is the founder and director of Sustainable Wellness and Health. He believes that the discussion of sustainability provides a platform to address today's most complex issues. So now, I leave you with Dr. Jorge Partida.
Well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be able to present this topic specifically. Just as a bit of background, I, as was mentioned, was born in Guadalajara and grew up with a grandmother who was a curandera. Later on was able to really get a direct sense of substance abuse and the impact of that on family and tradition as a result of my dad. After we migrated to Chicago from Guadalajara, my dad began to drink heavily, and as the oldest, I was often the one that was trying to take care of him, including lying about my identity so that I would pass as a person seeking services for 12-step programs and having people come and visit our house only to have my dad be surprised by the visits. So the topic of integrating culture and the treatment of substance abuse and substance use disorders has been very personal and very professional in my work. I've worked a great deal with gang youth, and many of the gang youth that I worked with have suffered from addiction problems in addition to the violence and difficulty that they have seen. So in my experience, addiction is a huge issue in large part because of the silence and stigma that's attached to the addiction problem, and because we still tend to sort of unfortunately incorporate addiction as part of a cultural norm, and obviously it is not. But I wanted to start with this slide and just kind of
Dr. Partida, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
But we didn't do the poll questions, and
okay.
I think it's a good idea that we do them
Absolutely.
now so that you can have an idea of who our audience is. So
great, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
So we're going to go ahead with that. So everyone, we're going to do a poll questioning now. We have a few questions. The first one is, are you planning to serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders in the next 6 months? So we have 100% yes, 94% sorry, yes. Okay. So our next question is, do you currently serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders? Okay, so 93% say yes. The next one is, what is your current professional role? Okay, so we have about 43% administrator, policymaker. We have 32% counselor therapist, and 15% social worker, and 13% case manager. What type of setting do you currently work in? So 37% substance use disorder treatment inpatient, 15% university research, and 44% other. Which field of work do you represent? And we have 45% mental health, 10% university research, 10% education, 5% policy, and 33% other. Okay, so now we're going to do our pre-test, and the first question is, U.S.-born Hispanics report higher rates of substance use, mild, moderate, and severe, than Hispanics born outside the U.S. True or false? Okay, so we have 76% true, 23% false. Hispanic youth have the lowest rates of substance use compared to blacks and whites. True or false? %81 false. And our last question, Mexican Americans who are offered treatment within an ethnicity-specific program are 11 times more likely to return for subsequent sessions. True or false? So 81% true. Okay. So those are questions for now. So now, Dr. Partida, I'm going to change presenter so you can have control of the screen.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and sorry about that.
That's okay. I appreciate that. So as I was saying, the topic of substance use and substance use disorders and culture has been obviously a topic that's been very close and personal in my life. And in many ways, I believe that the whole emphasis for my professional work has been to try to integrate culture into treatment, and because I have seen both personally and professionally just how critical that inclusion really is. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but I wanted to start our presentation by having you take a look at one of
Can you hear us? Hello? Sorry, everyone. I'm going to get a hold of him because I don't know what happened, but apparently we lost communication. Okay, he's reconnecting now. Okay.
All right, sorry about that. I
Yes.
apologize. We got disconnected here. So as I was saying, let's start with the first slide, which states that U.S.-born Hispanics report higher rates of substance use in all categories, mild, moderate, and severe, than Hispanics born outside the United States. And as we talk about our presentation, I want you to start thinking about why you think that might be. I think that this would be a great point for discussion. But this actually starts from more with second generation than first generation. And in fact, it seems that first generation Latinos actually have some sort of inoculation from this reality. But that inoculation quickly wears off, particularly after 8th grade. We tend to see first generation Latino students from 8th grade being most susceptible to serious substance use, and by the time our students are in 12th grade, they have been the ones with greatest participation in some serious drugs, including amphetamines and even heroin. So as we see, heroin is greatly on the rise. So Hispanic youth have the highest rates of substance use compared to blacks and whites, and this statistic is also something that we can begin to be concerned about, because it actually is magnified by the amount of the statistics of youth that are actually falling out of our public school systems at mass numbers. In the Latino community, we see that that percentage of high school dropouts actually is in the 40% across the United States. I think there are other factors that have a specific weight on youth and addiction, particularly as we look at schools that our Latino youth attend, being what's called super segregated schools, where 90 to 100% of attendees are non-white students. And as a result of that, obviously there's less resources, less not only economic resources, but social resources that can actually act as a buffer protecting our youth from addiction and other challenges. So we do know that culture is curative. Culturally relevant and competent treatment approaches and clinical settings are critical to the successful recovery outcomes for Latinos. And what this means, obviously, is we need to really define and talk about what we mean by culturally relevant and competent treatment approaches. It oftentimes in doctorate programs, such as the one that I worked at in other programs, we try to focus on defining this concept, because cultural competency and cultural relevancy has to go way beyond the language skill set of someone. Just because a clinician is able to speak the same language does not necessarily make them culturally relevant or competent. There is a need to really have a direct awareness of the culture and as well as the challenges that cultural groups are experiencing in urban and rural settings. And so to the extent that a clinician is aware of treatment and approaches, and the population as well, that is actually going to make a huge difference in treatment outcomes. And so we want to make sure that more and more we spend some time and energy defining what is meant by cultural competency. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation, but this is also another great question for us to begin to think about, is when we talk about cultural competency and cultural relevancy, what does that mean to you, and how do you view this concept of relevancy? And let's So one of the things that we've been exploring is the cultural competency and the isolation from culture, from our homeland and extended family and social networks, is this sense of isolation increases the likelihood of substance use and disorders as well as depression. And this is an important fact to consider as we begin to see that most of our Latino families and youth are actually living in what we call super segregated communities, where there is more of a sense of isolation from services. There's a difficulty in accessing quality care. And what we mean by quality care is not just the availability of educational services, but also obviously a support network that can help shield against some of the problems faced in addiction. I selected a song that I wanted to play for you. As music is an important element in our culture, we sometimes tend to romanticize the country that we left behind. But more than the sense of leaving a country behind, it's also a sense of leaving a connection, a sense of belonging, a sense of rootedness. And so as we hear in this famous song, oftentimes there is this longing to be back to the homeland. The singer says that he's far away from the home that he saw him be born. He's invaded by his nostalgia, and it invades his every thought. And when I see myself alone and sad like a leaf in the wind, I just want to cry. I just want to die of sorrow. O land of the sun, I long to see you. Now that far away I live with a light without love.
Hello, everyone. We're having some connection issues with our presenter. We're trying to make the necessary arrangements so we can get the most out of this presentation. I will appreciate if you can wait for a couple minutes to see if we can reconnect with our presenter. Again, we apologize for the inconvenience.
Hi, sorry about that. It looks like I am, it shows that I am on here. But
all right.
try again.
Okay. Okay, we're going to. Okay, we can hear you now, Dr. Partida.
Okay.
And then we're just gonna turn over the presentation to you.
Okay.
So you can show your screen and have control of the presentation. So I'm just gonna do that right now.
All right. Show my screen.
Right, and I think that.
Can you see that?
There we go. I think that we will have to replay the song that you were trying to share with us.
All right.
Because we were not able to listen to it. So.
Okay, sounds good. Let me see if I can do that. Can you hear that? Are you able to hear that?
No, we're not able to listen to it, but.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. Show my. All right. So maybe we're.
Yeah, we will probably have to skip this
Forgo,
part at
we'll
this
probably
time.
have to forego that.
Yeah, and then if we could expand your screen, that'll be better, so we can see the entire slide.
Okay.
So if you go to slideshow, there you go.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
All right.
All
My
right.
pleasure. All right, I think we're back on. I'm so sorry about that. And it sounds like you're not able to hear the song that we were playing. It's a song by Cuco Sanchez, famous Mexican author, who talks about the yearning and longing that he has for the homeland and how far he finds himself now living without light and without love. And oftentimes it's these kind of these feelings of depression and isolation that are very difficult to express. I think particularly for men, Latino men, the ability to talk about that longing and that disconnect is very difficult. And so oftentimes we begin to use substances as a means of addressing that depression and isolation that we're not able to talk about. What also adds to the isolation from culture and homeland is obviously that there are so many Latinos that are still living in terror, undocumented, and as we know, we have actually faced the greatest number of deportations under this current administration that we have ever in history. And so now we actually have families that have children born here in the United States who are actually parents are deported, and so along with them are their children. And so we have the largest number of cases of individuals who are actually U.S.-born children who now are living in the United States, in Mexico, undocumented. All of these stressors actually add a great deal to the addiction paradigms that we are facing, along with the fact that so many of our social service organizations and health providers are ill-equipped to really deal with the number of individuals that are coming through with substance use disorders and depression. So this sense of isolation, as we see, is something that we're going to, I think, in the future begin to see more and more of. But as was stated earlier, culture does work when it is logically and systemically implemented into a treatment model. In one specific research outcome, we see that Mexican Americans who are offered treatment within an ethnicity-specific program are 11 times more likely to return for subsequent sessions. And there are models out there that integrate not only music, as the one song that I was playing, but also stories and myths and legends, as well as cultural lessons. And what begins to happen is as youth and adults that are experiencing, that are in these clinical settings that are culture specific, they begin to see a sense of relevance and begin to see a sense of ownership. And that sort of isolation, that sense of difference or not belonging is actually highlighted rather than sort of marginalized. And so we find that there are actually greater retention rates and greater recovery outcomes when we're talking corridos and Latin music as a regular component to group settings, and they're able to clients are able to talk about what the music actually signifies, especially in our Latin culture. Music is a major component, and so it makes sense that we would find some way of trying to integrate that into substance abuse treatment culture. Addiction is a major problem of modernity. While alcohol continues to be the most frequently used substance, more and more we are seeing that Latinos are diagnosed with polysubstance use and co-occurring disorders. Now, this obviously is for many reasons. One of these reasons is we're beginning to see lack of funding being impacted mostly in substance abuse programs. As many major cities like San Francisco and Chicago begin to see that substance abuse problems and addiction comes out of their general fund, there's more and more pressure to limit the expenditure of these general fund dollars and find more appropriate quote-unquote doors for clients to come in. And so what that does is it creates the behavioral health or dual diagnosis track where individuals have to meet a more rigorous clinical criteria in order to receive services. Now, when we couple this with the fact that Latinos already don't necessarily seek out social services, and particularly don't seek out services for dependence issues, then we have a profile, we have a clinical profile where Latinos are waiting longer and longer to receive the care that they need. And with addiction, specifically with alcoholism, this is a major concern as alcohol can do some serious damage to internal organs and to brain function. And so as stated here, while we still see, especially with adults, having alcohol as a primary diagnosis, alcoholism and alcohol addiction, we begin to see more and more addiction to other drugs. In California and in the migrant community particularly, and in the construction community as well, we begin to see more exploration of other substances such as crystal meth that allows people to work longer and not feel exhausted. The problem is that, as I mentioned, in rural areas, we're ill-equipped to deal with the results of that usage. We've seen havoc being wreaked on families and marriages, and so we still have a great deal of understanding and concern and specific programs that can address this more of a co-occurring presenting problem. The other thing that we're seeing, obviously, is that with substances like alcohol and crystal meth and other drugs, there is a greater likelihood that the individual is going to become severely depressed. And being able to cipher out the component and the role of depression and addiction becomes more and more critical. I would also say that I would also postulate that, you know, the addiction profile in a Latino is that it does present a different illness of sorts. Because the genesis of addiction in Latinos has much to do with isolation and some of the elements that we've talked about. When addiction does present in a clinical setting, there are some very specific things that we need to keep in mind. Culturally competent and relevant treatment is critical, as we've said before, but providers also need to be very familiar with what we call the assimilation and acculturation spectrum. As individuals entering into the addiction field, you know, one of the things that has often been used to describe treatment programs is that, well, you can't treat all Latinos the same because we have such great diversity. And so to talk about creating a Latino-specific substance abuse program is difficult to do because, you know, there's so many diversity issues within that setting and that category. And then obviously, you know, not everybody's the same acculturation, assimilation spectrum. To me, that's kind of a cop-out argument. We need to be focusing on what makes us cohesive as Latinos. There are much more similarities between Latinos than non-Latinos, and so for us to begin to think about what makes us Latinos, we also have this element of we have an element of colonization, we have an element of repression, and depending on how we interpret that for ourselves, it's going to say a whole lot of how we approach work with clients. But it's important that these tough questions or these difficult dialogues are held, and oftentimes, you know, we kind of shy away from these discussions, but they're critical in understanding not only our perspective, our own identity, but then how we also approach treatment outcomes with our population. You know, the other thing that we need to consider is in addition to the assimilation acculturation spectrum, is just the divergent worldviews and perspectives. curanderismo, espiritismo, santeria, and other culture-bound views of health and wellness are very popular. They're very popular, and I would say in some large cities, growing. And we can all speculate the reasons why, but a major component of why alternative healing methods become more and more popular in the Latino community is because access to traditional healthcare and access to healthcare that actually has a culture-based component to it are very difficult to find. And so, we do have a lot of Latinos who are actually going to curanderas or espiritistas, santeros, to be able to receive some culture-focused treatment. Now, regardless of your views, there are people out there that are doing a great deal of positive work with the community, but then there's also a lot of people that are taking advantage of our communities and not providing quality care. There is no licensure. There is no, there's nobody sort of looking over to see what type of treatment our population is receiving. And so, oftentimes in these settings, people can get hurt and can go without receiving the quality care that they really need and depend. And we're talking about this isolation and this lack of service not only impacting our adult population, but obviously, many mothers out there are head of households and are also obviously impacting the health and well-being of their children. So as we talk about cultural competencies, it's really important for us to think about religious diversity out there. It's important for us to explore and become more familiar with native healing traditions, to look at the values of a culture. And so, we often talk about familialismo, and we talk about, the extended family and the value of the extended family in Latino cultures. And while that is still true, we also have to begin to accept the fact that these values are disappearing as we become more modernized and more focused on our sort of modern traditions. We begin to value less and less those traditions. We begin to have less respect for the extended family. And as families are torn apart by deportation and by isolation, this sense of the extended family, while it can inoculate against some of the major problems that we talked about, can also be a problem because we don't see the extended family as much as we used to. The whole idea of having your uncles and your grandmother live next door, that's becoming more and more of a rarity. And so those things that actually do inoculate the Latino community are becoming more and more difficult to deal with. And I also talk a little bit about the importance of us knowing our cosmology, because it's very important to understand that while, for example, traditional psychology is based on Greek mythology, those of us that come from a Latino background do share a different cosmology, a different understanding of how the world was created, a different set of myths of creation. And it's very important because the traditional perspective of creation for Latinos, and so many Latinos are Catholic, often the perspective of Catholicism is to teach the whole concept of original sin, and especially to Latinos, we begin to sort of hit our chest and blame ourselves for everything that has happened and begin to see ourselves as sinners, where many of the myths of creation from culture of origin, our Latino culture of origin myths, talk about a creation in the view of the Creator. We are direct descendants of our Creator, and we're direct expressions of that power that made us. And so it really does bring a very different way of being on earth if you begin to see yourself as a sinner from birth versus an expression of the divine from the very beginning. And so teaching mythology to our clients and teaching their mythology to our population can not only give them a sense of rootedness and a sense of connectedness to their culture, but it actually begins to act as an inoculation against addiction. It's also important for us to look at other health and wellness models out there. And, the reason why I got in, and a lot of people ask me, what's the psychologist doing involved with sustainability? But for me, it's really critical that we begin to look at the problems that we have as a community, including addiction, not from a deficit model, not from what's wrong with the addict, but what is missing. In treatment, in cultural treatment, one of the things that curanderismo, santeria, espiritismo, all of these sort of cultural traditions that look at wellness, what they have in common is a reintegration of the self, a reintegration of the individual into the cultural norm. And so treatment is not so much based on, you know, what's wrong with you, but treatment is really based on how can we get you to be back into the fold of the community, of the family, of that extended embrace of the group that identifies you. We got to remember that in Latino traditions and in Latino culture, the self, the ego, is de-emphasized. It's not so much about you, and it's not so much about having things your way and being all that you can be. It's really much more about what you can offer and what you have to offer to the group. Who you are and what you mean has much to do with your placement within an extended family and within the community. So we don't so much celebrate you as an individual. We celebrate what you're capable of doing within the group setting that you're in. And that's an important distinction, because as we see so many of our youth, you know, we're teaching hyper competition and we're teaching hyper individualization, when in reality for a lot of Latinos that actually is counterintuitive and counterproductive. We are much more of a collaborative people. We're much more of a sharing people than really looking at survival of the fittest and trying to do away with the competition. So when we do enter into a educational setting, into a work setting, into sort of a traditional cultural setting, and we find that there's great disparities between what we view as our values and ideals and what the major population does, what the traditional culture does, we begin to distance ourselves from even playing a role within our culture and community. And that sense of isolation is what begins the exploration of addiction in many ways as a means of dealing with all of this. So independent of any specific religious belief, and again, you know, it doesn't matter what religion you practice, what has been found to be curative and to help in treatment of addiction is a connection with a reality than larger than our immediate physical environment. You know, and this is particularly important as we begin to see, for example, you know, in the days today with our iPhones and with all the sense that we're somehow connected to this world web, and that, you know, with one push of a button, we can Google anything and have any bit of information. We can be connected on Facebook to thousands of people across the world. But the fact of the matter is that there's a discrepancy between the perception of connectedness and the loss of social skills, the loss of community that becomes very significant, particularly with Latinos who have operated and have created networks of socialization that really do work to normalize and to create a sense of identity. So this sense of spirituality, this sense of being connected to something larger than ourselves is critical, particularly in our adult years. And I put up here the title of Collective Unconscious because it reminds me of a teaching of Carl Jung, who said that, you know, we don't just inherit from our ancestors the color of our eyes or our height or the color of our skin. We also inherit their collective experience. We inherit their experiences of being Latinos in that generation, of fighting, of trying to make it happen, of dreams and aspirations. Those are all also part of our collective unconscious. And in programs, treatment programs that do emphasize a cultural element, we begin to honor ancestors and begin to honor the role of our ancestors in our present lives. And there is an understanding from cultural teachings that we're not just sort of this independent body. We are, as you will, a sentence in a book. The book has chapters that came before and has chapters that come after, but how we ourselves, how we understand our sentence, how we understand our addition to that book is critical, particularly as we begin to see it in connection to those that came before us and the contributions that we as Latinos can make to future generations. So this is a critical lesson for us to learn. Eric Erickson also talks about the need for us to be generative rather than to stagnate. If we don't feel ourselves a component of something larger than ourselves, there is that danger of getting stagnated in life, a feeling that we're not moving forward, that we have nothing to contribute, that our lives are insignificant. And so this sense of culture embedded in treatment programs also really helps to create that sense of generativity. So, you know, the one thing that, and the one sort of subpopulation that we really need to be concerned about, in my opinion, is our our youth. Our youth are facing greater challenges today than ever before. We are seeing that, as I mentioned, from 8th grade on to 12th grade, young people, particularly second generation, the youth, become very much in danger of being exposed to serious drugs and dependence. And when you look at our statistics in schools, you know, you begin to see why that might be. As I said before, we've got 40% of our population, our young population, dropping out of school before they finish high school. But the other thing is just looking at the U.S. Census figures. We look, for example, at the number of bachelor's degree individuals that complete bachelor's degree broken down by ethnicity, and we look at the three major ethnic groups being white, black, and Latino. We see that white students have, from 1975 to the present, have seen a steady growth in the number of individuals that have a bachelor's degree. In the African American community, the numbers are much lower, but there is this sort of steady increase in the number of individuals who, in today, have completed a bachelor's degree. That, unfortunately, is not the case with the Latino community. From 1975 till today, we still see very much an insignificant difference in the number of individuals that are able to complete a bachelor's degree. And so we have to be, and this is no mystery, and it's not it's not an unknown fact to many of the universities. I just participated in a hearing on the status of education, higher education in Latinos, and UCLA, USC, and all the major universities are basically saying the same thing. Our population is ill-equipped. Young men and women who enter into the university need oftentimes remedial support that the universities are not able to provide. And so this sense of doors closing obviously adds very much to the sense of addiction as an escape route for our Latino youth. And so we have to, in my opinion, the other thing that I have to say is, you know, having been director of behavioral health for the Department of Public Health, is that there are many social service organizations out there that are reluctant to see addiction in young people, in part because there is a greater legal liability when providing addiction services and treatment to youth. But there's also a sense of being blinded to addiction, dependence issues and addiction in young people. And so many programs out there are sort of really lacking the infrastructure to be able to deal with treatment of addiction in the young. We're much more comfortable talking about prevention, but, you know, oftentimes it's not enough for us to talk about prevention. We actually have to start to address serious addiction issues in our youth. So, you know, this is what does it all mean? We've talked so much about statistics and figures and a problem of you know, programs not really emphasizing culture as part of the addiction problem. But what does it all mean? If we look at substance use disorders are become a form of self-medication that we often use for dealing with isolation, depression, and challenges with assimilation, these issues are not likely to go away. While Latino culture is diverse and represents a broad range of experiences, its similarities really need to be emphasized and used as the central theme for the creation of treatment programs that really do emphasize a culture-based approach. And as Latinos, we've often have been called the invisible minority, in part because we don't tend to speak up. We know that the greatest predictor of educational outcomes in youth is the level of participation of parents in the school system. Yet many of our parents are very hesitant to attend services or to go to a school requesting services for many reasons. And we talk about intimidation, we talk about lack of appropriate legal documentation, and with all the deportations that we've been seeing, these fears are not unfounded. But we must consider growing challenges in education, employment, housing, healthcare, and social justice. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so involved in sustainability. It's no longer enough for us to emphasize what's lacking in our community. Even if we have really great treatment programs that are focusing on culture, but we still have a population that is disproportionately represented and impacted by lack of education, lack of employment, lack of affordable housing, healthcare, and social justice issues, then we ourselves can't become part of the problem by continuing to address a small component, say, for example, the problem of addiction, without really looking at that role within the larger context. Adults and young people are more likely to leave a addiction disorder, to leave a life of addiction, if they see a clear path for employment, for education, for housing. And so we must begin to sort of reinvent the whole case management, the whole supportive network of Latino services, and begin to recognize that whatever culturally appropriate treatment we provide, it has to be viewed within the lens of a much more comprehensive approach to treatment. Now, that comprehensive approach to treatment is our responsibility and our responsibility alone. We cannot give that responsibility, we cannot give the responsibility of creating and forging these relationships with a much more comprehensive approach to the client, who, as we've stated, is already dealing with isolation, is already dealing with depression, and doesn't really understand how the network really works. So it really is up to the provider to begin to recognize that addiction is a serious problem, but it is a problem within a continuum that needs to be recreated and reinvented for our population. And so with that, I'm going to stop and hear from you. I want to hear your questions and comments.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Partida. We have
Are we there?
Yes,
Can you
we're
hear
here. Yes. We have a few questions.
Awesome. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
How would someone go about being trained in culture-specific treatment?
That's a great question, and I think that it starts from the formation. We are seeing more and more university programs having an emphasis on culture-specific approaches to treatment, and so it starts there. When I was directing a doctorate program, we took a group of doctorate students to Chiapas to work with elders and really talk about more than really talking to them. We actually were learning from them about the role of healing in communities like that. And so I am pleased by the fact that more and more doctorate programs are including culture-based specific programs and specific approaches in the teaching. But it really is it's up to the student to demand that these classes be implemented. So it starts at training.
Okay, great. Also, could you mention some of the treatment models that have been proven to be effective with Hispanics?
Absolutely. We can talk about youth programs and adult programs. Starting with youth programs, there are actually several programs that have been considered best practices. And the interventions are life skills training, or LST, the Say Yes First program, the Familias Unidas program, Keeping It Real, and real is capitalized, R-E-A-L, and another program called Nuestras Familias, Andando Entre Culturas, is another program that has been proven effective. These programs focus on promoting protective, intrapersonal, and or contextual factors. And these interventions really have greater utilization and efficacy when families are involved in the approach. Now, when we talk about strategies to address prevention, those strategies that emphasize engagement and group cohesion have greater outcomes. One way to promote group cohesion is through the use of participatory learning so that we are able to deliver intervention components. In participatory learning, usually the group leaders are viewed as collaborators rather than experts by parents. So the group leader facilitates the acquisition of skills through active parent participation. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about factors that have been effective with the adult population, there are certain tools that have been utilized with some success, and including the employment of the ASI, or the Addiction Severity Index, with the Latino population, and then also tools such as the Drinker's Inventory of Consequences, mm-hmm. A 50-item questionnaire that measures adverse consequences of drinking. So some of these programs have been found to be effective. And as I mentioned before, there are specific cultures around the nation, like the program in Haas and the Latino Commission in San Francisco, that utilize myth, storytelling, music, and sharing as components of cultural programs. So some of the assessment tools of drug abuse problems that are recommended to be used with Latinos and Latino adolescents includes the Comprehensive Addiction Severity Index for adolescents, mm-hmm. And then the Personal Experience Inventory. So those are some of the tools and approaches that we know have worked in the past.
Okay, perfect. We actually have a few more questions, but what we can do is, we've done previously, is that we will post the questions and the written answers on our webpage. So I will send them to you, and then we'll post them maybe a week from today, so that people can access them. So thank you again, Dr. Partida. We're almost done with today's webinar. And for everyone here, remember that an electronic copy of today's PowerPoint and audio will be available at our website at www.attcnetwork.org/Hispanic Latino. So remember to look for that. Also, we want to invite everyone to our upcoming national conference, which is titled Integrating Research, Education, and Services to Reduce Behavioral Health Disparities in Hispanic and Latino Populations, which will be held in October 8th and 9th of this year at the University of Texas at Austin. So the conference is based on the fundamental premise that significant disparities exist in access to behavioral health resources and services for Hispanic and Latino populations, particularly in the areas of mental health and substance use disorders. So we want to provide a learning space where people can learn from research, but also gain clinical skills that they can use with our population. So this concludes today's webinar. I would like to thank Dr. Partida again for his wonderful presentation. Please look at our website to learn about future webinars. And as you leave today's webinar, you'll be directed to complete a brief survey about your experience. Your feedback is very important to us, and we appreciate you taking the time to tell us what you thought of today's webinar. So, gracias everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.